The bubble that broke Britain. South Sea Company, 1720. It is the summer of 1720. London is the richest city on earth. And in a narrow, cobbled street called Exchange Alley, something extraordinary is happening. The coffee houses, Jonathan's, Garraway's, are so packed that men are spilling out onto the street, shouting prices, waving papers, grabbing strangers by the lapels. The air smells of pipe smoke and desperation and something else. Something that always hangs over a crowd that believes it has discovered the secret to unlimited wealth. The smell of certainty. Tailors are trading. Bakers are trading. Clergymen, soldiers, widows, members of the House of Lords, all of them jostling for position, all of them buying shares in the South Sea Company. In January, those shares cost £128. By May, they were £550. By June, nearly £900. And now, in the first week of August, if you can find a seller, they are changing hands at over £1,000 per share. That is an 800% rise in 8 months. Every single day, fortunes are being made. The newspapers are full of stories. A seamstress who turned £50 into $400. A merchant who mortgaged his house, bought shares, and is now richer than his landlord. A member of Parliament who would rather not discuss how he came to own so many shares, or why he voted the way he did. Somewhere in this city, a man named Isaac Newton, the man who explained gravity, invented calculus, and mapped the motion of every planet in the known universe, is watching all of this. He had invested early. He had been sensible. He sold his shares at £350, banked a profit of roughly £7,000, and walked away. The rational decision, the disciplined exit. And then he watched the price keep climbing. He watched his friends getting richer every week. He sat in the same coffee houses, heard the same stories, read the same newspapers. Week after week, the number went up. Week after week, the fortune he did not make grew larger in his imagination. He couldn't stand it. He went back in, near the top, with everything he had. Isaac Newton, the greatest scientific mind in the history of the human race, invested £20,000 in the South Sea Company at almost exactly the worst possible moment. Within weeks, it would be nearly gone. And in the silence that followed, he said something that has echoed across every bubble ever since. I can calculate the motions of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people. Welcome to Market Mayhem. When greed meets gravity, I'm your host. Today, the crash that broke Britain, destroyed a generation of investors, corrupted an entire government, and proved that genius is absolutely no defense against FOMO. Episode 3. Let's begin. To understand how Britain lost its collective mind over a company that traded almost nothing, you need to understand the problem that company was supposedly solving. It is 1711. Britain has just fought a decade of catastrophically expensive wars. The War of the Spanish Succession, a sprawling European conflict that had dragged on for 10 years and consumed enormous treasure. The bill, when it came due, was staggering. The national debt sat at roughly £10 million. The government was borrowing at punishing interest rates just to function. The finances of the most powerful nation on earth were quietly a disaster. Robert Harley, the Earl of Oxford and Queen Anne's chief minister, needed a solution. And he found one. Elegant in its construction, ruinous in its eventual execution. What if you could turn the national debt into stock? Here is how it worked. A new company, the South Sea Company, would be created and granted a monopoly on all British trade with South America and the Pacific Islands. In exchange for this monopoly, the company would agree to absorb a large portion of the national debt. Creditors who were owed money by the government would be offered shares instead. The government would pay interest to the company rather than to thousands of individual creditors. The company would theoretically grow rich from its South American trade, and everyone would benefit. It was a sophisticated piece of financial engineering, and it had one enormous, glaring, fundamental flaw. Britain was still at war with Spain. Spain controlled South America. The monopoly was theoretical. There was no trade. There might never be trade. The South Sea Company's entire business model was built on a story about wealth that did not yet exist and might never exist. But stories, in the right hands, at the right moment, are enormously powerful. The company did eventually send a few ships. The results were meager. Spain, under a separate treaty, allowed one British vessel per year, and even those voyages barely turned a profit. The actual commercial operations of the South Sea Company were, by any honest assessment, nearly worthless. The directors of the company understood this, and they also understood something more important. It didn't matter. What mattered was the share price. What mattered was the story. What mattered was maintaining the perception of limitless future wealth, gold and silver and spices flowing from an entire continent, long enough for the scheme to grow too large to fail. They were, in this sense, not so different from the promoters of every speculative venture that has come before or since. The asset didn't need to generate returns. It just needed to generate belief. For 9 years, they managed it. And then, in 1720, watching John Law's Mississippi Company send French share prices into the stratosphere just across the English Channel, the South Sea directors decided to go bigger. Much bigger. They lobbied Parliament to let them take over the entire national debt, now grown to over £30 million, and convert it all into South Sea stock. Parliament said yes, and London went completely, spectacularly insane. When the South Sea scheme was approved in April 1720, shares were trading at around £300. By the end of May, they had hit 550. By mid-June, they crossed 850. And by the first week of August, the absolute peak, South Sea shares were changing hands at over £1,000 each. 800% in 8 months. In Exchange Alley, the narrow lanes of the City of London, where financial business had been conducted for a generation, the scene was unlike anything the city had ever witnessed. Jonathan's Coffee House, the forerunner of the London Stock Exchange, was a madhouse. Bodies pressed wall to wall, prices shouted across the room. Men who had never owned a single share in their lives stood alongside seasoned merchants and titled members of Parliament, all of them buying. The composer, George Frederick Handel, invested. Members of the royal family held shares. Even Jonathan Swift, who was writing biting satire about exactly this kind of madness, reportedly had money in the market. The mania spawned an entire ecosystem of derivative lunacy. Hundreds of new joint stock companies launched in the weeks following the South Sea scheme's approval. Most of them were completely fraudulent. One offered shares in a company developing a wheel for perpetual motion. Another, and this one is almost too perfect, raised subscription money for, and I'm quoting directly here, an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. That company was reportedly fully subscribed within hours of opening its books. The promoter collected his deposit money and was never seen again. The South Sea directors, watching these copycats drain investment from their own stock, successfully lobbied Parliament to pass the Bubble Act in June 1720, legislation that made competing joint stock ventures illegal without parliamentary authorization. A bubble at its very peak, passing laws against other bubbles. The irony would be almost funny if the ending weren't so devastating. And it was in this environment, this screaming, shoving, tobacco-reeking fever of paper fortunes and impossible promises, that Isaac Newton made his fatal decision. He had sold at £350, sensibly, rationally, profitably. He had walked away with £7,000. Then the price went to 400, then 500, then 600. He watched. He waited. He told himself it was madness. He told himself he knew better. And then he stopped telling himself anything at all and simply bought back in. £20,000 at close to the peak. This is the thing that makes Newton's story so devastating and so important. He wasn't stupid. He wasn't ignorant. He wasn't even careless. He was perfectly, completely, classically human. He had watched people less intelligent than him get richer than him for months on end. And he had reached the limit of what any human brain, regardless of its capacity for calculating the orbits of celestial bodies, can actually endure. The fear of missing out is older than any market. It is older than money itself. And it has been ending careers and fortunes for as long as there have been both. It is August 1720, and the mechanism of destruction has already been built. Most people just don't know it yet. The South Sea Company, in its desperation to keep share prices rising, has been doing something deeply dangerous, lending money to its own shareholders so they can buy more shares, using those very same shares as collateral. It is a structure of almost sublime fragility. As long as the price rises, the loans are backed. As long as the loans are backed, shareholders feel secure. As long as shareholders feel secure, they buy more. As long as they buy more, the price rises. But reverse any single link in that chain, and the whole thing runs backwards, faster, and with far more violence than it rose. The first cracks appear quietly. A few of the largest shareholders, the ones who bought earliest and have the most to lose from a slow unwind, begin selling. Not in a panic, just quietly, systematically, taking profits while the price is still above 1,000. But markets notice selling, even when it's quiet. By the second week of August, South Sea shares are at £800, then 750. The drift is gentle at first. People tell each other it is a healthy correction. The newspapers maintain their enthusiasm. The company directors say nothing publicly. By end of August, shares are at 600. Then the margin calls start arriving. Remember those loans the company made to shareholders who used shares as collateral. As the price falls, the collateral is worth less. The loans become under-collateralized. The company demands more collateral or repayment. Shareholders who borrowed heavily to buy more shares now have to sell those shares to repay the loans. More selling. Lower prices. More margin calls. It is September now. Shares are at £400, then 300. The coffee houses that 2 months ago were roaring with the noise of fortune-making are now very, very quiet. Men sit in corners staring at tables. Nobody is shouting prices anymore. Nobody wants to hear them. By end of September, South Sea shares are at £150, from over 1,000 to 150, in less than 2 months. The letters arriving at Parliament tell the human story with brutal clarity. A linen draper, who borrowed everything he owned against shares, now worth a fraction of his debt. A widow, who placed her life savings into what the newspapers had called the investment of the century. A clergyman, a man who counseled others on moral clarity, who told his congregation that investing in the South Sea Company was consistent with God's will, and who is now facing questions he has no answer for. Not one of them was bailed out. Not one of them received a rescue package. In 1720, if you speculated and lost, the consequences were yours alone. The contrast with every financial crisis since is not subtle. The political reckoning, when it came, was savage. Parliamentary investigations in late 1720 and early 1721 uncovered corruption on a scale that shocked even a political class that was not easily shocked. The directors of the South Sea Company had been handing out fictitious shares, stock allocated without payment, to key government ministers in exchange for their support of the scheme. It was, by any honest description, bribery. Systematic, calculated, and effective. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, John Aislabie, was found guilty of corruption. He was expelled from Parliament and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Several company directors attempted to flee to the continent. They were tracked down, arrested, and their estates confiscated, sold off to partially compensate investors, though the recovery amounted to a fraction of what had been lost. Robert Walpole, who had consistently opposed the scheme and warned against it, was brought in to manage the aftermath. He restructured the remaining debt, stabilized the banking system, and restored enough confidence to prevent total collapse. In doing so, he became the most powerful politician in Britain, effectively the country's first prime minister, holding that position for over 20 years. One man's principled refusal to chase a bubble built the most consequential political career of the 18th century. For ordinary investors, there was no Walpole to ride to the rescue. You lost your money. The courts offered limited remedy. The directors' confiscated estates provided pennies. The lesson of the South Sea bubble, for the thousands of individuals who had mortgaged homes and borrowed savings and trusted newspapers and politicians, was as old and as brutal as markets themselves. If you speculate and lose, no one is coming to save you. The Bubble Act, that piece of legislation the South Sea directors had lobbied for to suppress their competitors, remained on the books. For over a century, until 1825, it restricted the formation of joint stock companies across Britain. Historians have argued ever since about whether it stunted British financial innovation during the Industrial Revolution. What is not in dispute is that an act of corporate self-interest designed to protect a fraudulent company's share price during a speculative mania shaped British corporate law for more than 100 years. And Newton? He reportedly refused to discuss the South Sea Company for the rest of his life. The greatest mathematician who had ever lived had, at the worst possible moment, become the most ordinary of investors. He had watched. He had waited. He had bought at the top. He had lost most of it. And he had learned the hard way that there is no formula for calculating what another human being will believe tomorrow morning. So what does the South Sea bubble teach a modern trader? 3 things. They map directly to mind, method, and money. And 300 years have not made a single one of them less relevant. The mind lesson is the Newton problem, and it is the most important one. Isaac Newton was the most intelligent human being alive. He had already made a profitable trade in South Sea shares. He had already made the rational exit. And then he watched. That's the key word. He watched while people less capable than him, with less information than him, became richer than him. And that watching did something that no amount of intelligence can prevent. It made him feel like he was missing out. Made him feel, viscerally, that the rules he operated by were costing him something real. And eventually, it overrode everything he knew. This is not a failure of intelligence. This is not a failure of information. This is what FOMO does. It doesn't attack your analysis. It attacks your identity. It makes you feel like the person who sits this one out is a fool, not the person who jumps in at the top. The protection is not being smarter than Newton. Nobody reading this is smarter than Newton. The protection is a pre-committed rule, written down before the emotion arrives, that defines exactly when you will and will not enter a position. A rule you made when you were calm, that governs your behavior when you are not. The method lesson is about the difference between a story and a valuation. South Sea shares hit £1,000 based on a monopoly that was generating almost zero revenue. Nobody was asking what the earnings per share were. Nobody was asking what the price-to-earnings ratio implied about future growth. Because there were no earnings, there was only the story of limitless South American wealth, a beautiful, compelling, expertly maintained fiction. When your investment thesis cannot be expressed in numbers, when it can only be expressed in narrative, you are speculating. There is nothing wrong with speculating, but label it correctly, size it accordingly, and have a defined exit before you enter. The money lesson is leverage, the South Sea Company's self-defeating loan structure, lending to investors against their own shares, created the cascade that turned a correction into a catastrophe. The same structure appears in every major crash since: margin lending in 1929, mortgage leverage in 2008, borrowing platforms in the 2022 crypto collapse. Leverage is the multiplier that works both ways. It amplifies the upside so seductively that people forget, completely and absolutely, that it amplifies the downside by exactly the same factor. 3 lessons. 300 years old, still costing people money every single day. A company that traded almost nothing. A government that took bribes to approve it. A nation that lost its mind buying it. And the greatest scientist who ever lived, staring at a piece of paper, having lost £20,000, reduced to one sentence that has never stopped being true. I can calculate the motions of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people. Neither can we. But we can study it. We can see the pattern. A genuine opportunity. In this case, a real technology, real trade routes, a real reshaping of the world, dressed in a story so compelling that it detaches completely from any underlying reality. A crowd that is making money. A crowd that is making more money. The mounting psychological pressure on every rational person watching from the sidelines. And then the moment, the specific, identifiable, catastrophic moment, when the most disciplined among us finally break and step in. At the top. This is not a story about the 18th century. This is a story about the next bubble. Whatever it is. Whenever it comes. Because the next one is coming. And it will have a story just as good as this one. And the crowd will be just as certain. And the newspapers, whatever form they take, will be just as enthusiastic. Next time on Market Mayhem, the technology that really did change the world. Steam engines, railways, iron and ambition stretching across an entire continent. And a fraud so spectacular that the man at its center, the railway king, the most powerful businessman in Britain, ended his days in disgrace, hunted by his own investors. Iron horses and paper fortunes. Episode 4. If today's story made you think about your own trading, about the moments you have watched from the sidelines until you couldn't watch anymore, take the free mind, method, money assessment at CompleteTradersEdge.com/assessment. Find out where your edge has a gap, and grab the book, The Complete Trader's Edge, for the full framework. Links are in the description. Subscribe so you don't miss the next disaster.